But first, we start with our big conversation this week on shared spaces. As many of you know, the scheme has been halted by the UK government following the decision by Transport Minister Nusrat Ghani, who told the BBC the schemes just don't work for blind and partially sighted people. Now, while many are celebrating this news, others see the fight to stop shared spaces as far from over. Sandy Taylor campaigns for the charity National Federation of the Blind in their Scotland office and joined me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen.
Good to have you here. Yeah, it's good to be here because we want to talk about shared spaces this week. It is a really important topic that was in the headlines last week because of the announcement that the UK government had made the decision to halt any further shared space schemes. This, of course, I imagine from you would be very welcomed.
Absolutely. However, we really would like the Scottish Government to come out with a similar response.
So let's talk about that. So where are we at the moment? So the UK government, and you know a lot about this, so the UK government has halted shared space schemes. The Scottish Government silent on this as far as you're concerned?
They are at the moment. Following my petition back in December 2015 where I called for a moratorium, as a result of that, we had a seminar back in April of last year, and we followed that on. I am part of a working group who are looking at rewriting the guidelines that the Scottish Government give to local councils, and that is going out to tender at the moment. Looking for further research into shared space. Now, the UK government, I believe, are now embarking on a similar route, but they have taken the decision to have a moratorium, whereas we're still waiting in Scotland doing that.
Now, I know you've been involved in this campaign against shared spaces for a long time. In fact, the last time we were together, we were in a town outside of Glasgow called Kirkintilloch, which had its own shared space scheme installed. And you and I went for a walk to experience what it was like. Let's hear what that experience was like.
Here we are, just crossing Catherine Street, which is part of a four-armed junction, very busy junction in Kirkintilloch. And we're about to cross the road at an uncontrolled courtesy crossing. Here I feel the tactile marking under my feet. I'm very privileged today to have Mark here with me as my guide, otherwise I wouldn't be able to use this crossing at all. So we're now crossing the road, I believe, Mark?
Yep, and the car has courteously stopped for us.
And wonderful. For a change, we've got a courteous motorist who stopped for us. And that's us, I would imagine, at the other side, are we?
That's right.
I really don't have any idea where I am without Mark to guide me. Previously, we used to have safety railings here, and the railings funneled us to a safe crossing point at the traffic lights and pedestrian crossings. So I would imagine I'm outside Gemini Card Shop.
Yes, we are. We're looking towards crossing Cowgate from east to west, which is going to take us into Kerr Street.
So that was about 2 years ago we got together and experienced that. What happened in Kirkintilloch since then? Because there was a big campaign against this shared space scheme. Sandy, what happened?
Earlier this year, the Community Council, on behalf of the local councils, started a consultation. It was in two parts. One part was to do with the town, but they left out the shared space element. They didn't really want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about the historical heritage, local parks, etc. There was a separate consultation on the four-way junction that we spoke about at our last meeting. And as part of that consultation at the junction, 85% of respondents wanted the traffic lights with the control crossings to be reinstated.
And this was a general survey. This wasn't for blind people. This was for everybody to contribute.
That's correct. It was for everyone. So the council response to that was that they will have a further 18 months monitoring the system at the junction, and then we would probably have about 2 years planning before the traffic lights are reinstated. Now, to most of us, this is unacceptable. The town is dying because people are avoiding coming to the town because they feel unsafe.
So we're at a stage where 2 years on from the time you and I tried out the shared space, and in that recording you were trying it out with Mark there, and you just had no idea where you were. You were just walking across a road. You weren't even sure if you were on the road at the point when we were talking. That hasn't changed by this point. 2 years on.
2 years on, no. We are, I believe, getting a new control crossing halfway along the main street. Work on that hasn't started yet, but that will make some difference. But at the very north end of the town, my members of our local visually impaired group can no longer go to the local library. There is sheltered housing behind the library as well, and local residents there cannot independently cross the street.
So people just aren't going out. They're not going to visit the town.
They are not visiting. Even drivers avoid the town because of the uncertainty of who has right of way when in fact no one has. There are daily altercations. It is a shambles, and that was the description by Willie Rennie, the Lib Dem leader in Scotland, on a radio programme.
It's interesting to talk about this from a sort of wider point of view, thinking about the entire UK here, because of course, yes, the government has halted any future and any currently in progress shared space schemes that are either being put down or have been not put down. But the question is, what happens next for those schemes that are already in place, like you're experiencing where you are in Kirkintilloch? The experience is that, yes, there is a bit of a rollback going on, but it's taking a long time. What do you do about that? I mean, so the campaign's not over then, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. No, the Women in Equality Committee, who provided a report back in April of last year, they said that we must have control crossings. We must have proper curbs to navigate with. And that is the first thing that we need to do. We need to reinstate our curbs. We need to get control crossings back in place, to open our towns again and let our local community back into the town again.
Right, stick around, Sandy, because we're going to talk more about another angle to all of this that you want to bring up. Shared space schemes is one thing, but also another new feature of our streets, which doesn't come under the category of shared spaces, is cycling and pedestrians on the same part of the pavement, which seems to be a new thing these days, because the councils are trying to encourage more people to cycle, and they're trying to use existing road spaces. This is the Daily Connect with me, Stephen Scott, with Sandy Taylor today in the studio. We're talking about shared spaces and the whole experience of blind and partially sighted people getting out and using the towns and villages and cities and all these places which we want to get out in, but unfortunately our environments are changing around us because there are some people who think that levelling the playing field between car and person is a good idea, Sandy. That does seem ridiculous when you think about it, and interestingly, the general public are behind this.
Oh, the general public are very much against shared space, and my experience, certainly in Kirkintilloch, where I live, they are avoiding the town. Motorists are avoiding the town. It is just an unsafe environment.
Let's talk about a new style of scheme that's coming out. I don't know if there's a name for it yet. Maybe you'll know, but I've heard a lot about this. These schemes where cyclists and pedestrians are sharing the same space. So essentially, the pavement is kind of split into this bit's for cyclists and this bit is for pedestrians. How does that work for you as a blind person?
It doesn't. Simple as that, Stephen. It just doesn't work. And even cyclists, they want their own space. They want separation between themselves and motorists, and they want separation between themselves and pedestrians. There are schemes planned, like in Clydebank, where there will be no segregation between cyclists and pedestrians, and that is just unacceptable.
So what is that actually? I mean, you've been along to these to see what will become these schemes. You've mentioned Clydebank, just outside of Glasgow. Talk to me about what this actually will look like in practice, from what you understand.
One of the most alarming situations is what they call bus stop bypasses, where you have a cycle lane at the side of the road next to the pavement, but when you come to a bus shelter, if there is a bus stopped at the stop, for instance, the cycle lane goes round the back of the bus shelter. Now, can you imagine elderly and frail people, visually impaired people, stepping off a bus or trying to step onto a bus and have to cross a cycle lane to do so? Now, in my experience, cyclists do not want to lose momentum. They don't want to slow down. and they will zigzag around people, and that is extremely alarming for pedestrians, particularly visually impaired and disabled pedestrians.
What's the alternative, though, Sandy? I mean, what else can we do here? I mean, it would be, I guess it would be not appropriate to ask cyclists to go into the middle of the road between the bus and the car in that situation. So you wouldn't want them going down the middle between, so say there's two lanes on the road and you've got your pavement. This is what I'm imagining. So you've got a pavement, you've got a lane, and you've got a second lane, and then your cyclist has to go somewhere in amongst all that. Can't go on the inside because the bus has to stop. How do you work that? I mean,
I personally would suggest that cyclists wait behind the bus until it moves off.
So it's actually stop behind the bus and wait and then carry on?
Yes, indeed.
Right.
Indeed.
Because, I mean, it's interesting. There are lots of players in this, especially in the scheme that you've mentioned in Clydebank, and there are also schemes planned in Glasgow as well, in some of the streets there, that would mean that more people can use the towns. This is essentially what this is all about, is trying to bring the towns back to life. But you feel the opposite way.
Well, some of the cycle lanes, etc., are making it a no-go area for many pedestrians. Sauchiehall Street being one. There's got to be proper delineation between a cycleway and a pavement. There has got to be a safe way of crossing streets, and that means a control crossing from pavement to pavement, including the cycle lane. Cyclists have got to stop at a control crossing.
So this is something you're campaigning on. Do we have a name for this yet? I mean, we know shared spaces, but what would this be? Because it's kind of similar, isn't it?
It is. I mean, very often they are raising pavements of side streets, etc., to the same level as the pavement, and that is a shared space.
Because that definition is important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because there are councils, and we've seen this before, that councils who will try and say, well, it's not a shared space scheme. We had this situation in Belfast. We talked about it on the show last year, if not the year before, where we talked about a scheme there which the council was absolutely adamant was not a shared space. The courts, however, felt otherwise.
Yeah, we had exactly the same situation in Kirkintilloch. They say it's not really a shared space. But we have long areas of raised table, 40 metres, where we have several courtesy crossings on that. And there is only a 20mm kerb, which is nothing more than a trip hazard. And it is essentially a level surface and therefore a shared space.
I'm sure our listeners will have a lot to say on this, Sandy. Now, from your point of view, you do a lot of work with the National Federation of the Blind here. You're Scotland, essentially, are you?
I'm their spokesperson on shared space in Scotland, yes.
Well, tell us more about that organisation quickly, if you will.
Well, we have a branch in Scotland, but really the campaigning comes from. Well, you mentioned Sarah Gayton in the past. Sarah is
Sarah's on last week.
A very good campaigner, and together with a team, David Bates from our executive council, and a number of other people. I have a colleague, Peter Monk, who assists me. He's a former planner, understands council speak. He's a great help to me studying plans, etc. So we're very active in all shared spaces in Scotland. Recently there was one in Kinross, for instance, and the local people rose up against it, and they have now had control crossings reinstated, so it can be done. Councils should be listening to the local communities.
Well, that's what we're all about here, sharing the information and letting others act on it. It's important that we act, isn't it? Because, we're as a country, no matter who you are, where you are, we're all good at moaning about things, but it's important that you stand up and actually be heard.
Yes, absolutely.
And let the right people hear you.
And we must stick at it, because councils are hoping that we'll shut up and go away. Well, we won't. We are determined to see this through on behalf of visually impaired and disabled and elderly people in Scotland.
Well, we won't shut you up. Your voice is always welcome here, Sandy. Thank you so much for coming in.
That's my pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
The Daily Connect podcast.
Finally on the podcast today, a question we get a lot on our Tech Talk programme,